During the COVID pandemic, there was an idea that split society. The idea that the pandemic was all one big lie. The conspiracy exploded not because it was true, but because many people wanted it to be true. So why is something that is usually presented as an uncomfortable truth appealing? Well, it's because a world without an uncomfortable truth is boring. When you look at fictional worlds, they all have some sort of hidden evil, whether it be Sauron from Lord of the Rings or Agent Smith from The Matrix. An interesting world has to have a good side and a bad side. And because we perceive life as a long narrative, those same elements need to exist within our own world. So for people, the one bad guy everyone can point at is the government. This obviously doesn't mean that any criticism or even conspiracy against the state is unfounded, but rather that there's a very real psychological motive for why people tend to believe it. Humans are inherently selfish, and with that comes a need to stand out above the rest. And that's exactly what believing in a shadow government allows you to do. Because after watching a film like They Live or The Matrix, the very idea of the world being controlled in any way feels like something nobody else can see. All you have to do is adopt the conspiracy, connect the dots, real or not, and become more than anyone else. And you wouldn't be entirely wrong, because if you look at modern society, everyone is distracted. People spend more time on TikTok than they do with family or with actually meaningful stories. Watching a film is now something genuinely productive compared to how we usually spend time. So when you look at this culture of mindless consumption and call it what it is, you can't help but stand out. And this unpleasant reality can be essentially monetized in order to serve your own needs. Whether they are emotional or monetary, understanding human nature allows you to look at the world from a lens that only you can look through. If you apply more of the logic from stories like The Matrix, what you will find is that they also apply. So, for example, in The Matrix, nobody will believe you if you tell them they are in a simulation, because they are not yet ready. And if you go to someone and tell them to stop scrolling, they will also ignore you. Everything from these stories applies to the real world, and that makes them powerful. Therefore, if people already being mindless consumers is true, why not further themes like a shadow government? It doesn't prove it, but it gives the action a cause. Instead of saying humans have horrible control over themselves, you say humans have incredible control over other humans. So when you frame it in that way, it makes humanity more competent, even though the result is the same. But both from a logical and factual standpoint, conspiracies like the deep state do have real evidence. Historical events like the Watergate incident essentially allowed people to have a concrete reason to distrust the government, and really anyone with power. Because what happened was that the Nixon administration attempted to plant listening devices in key rooms at the Washington Watergate complex. But fortunately, this operation was accidentally uncovered and led to the resignation of President Nixon, who tried to deny his actions, fueling the public's distrust in the government. Therefore, there are real documented instances of the government doing really shady things. But what makes it even more frightening is that what if it is just what they want us to know? What if the government strategically plans these scandals in order to make people believe it's the whole truth? If Watergate never happened, then the conspiracy would still exist, because there would be no evidence to the contrary. Whereas with the scandal, it opens up interpretation as to whether the government is really that secretive and well operated. So any way that we look at this, there is always a real argument to be made for and against the idea of the deep state. And that's why it's easy to believe it without sounding like a lunatic. It's what allows things like the flat earth theory to persist in light of all evidence to the contrary. Because you can always use the argument that the government made everything up, whether it be the moon landing, coronavirus, climate change, or literally anything else. It is always easy to discredit anything that comes from a source you label as fake. So how do you tell what is true and what isn't? You use Occam's razor, the principle that the simplest answer is usually the right one, which is perfect for situations where you can't really disprove something crazy, and the only argument that you can use is to point out how crazy the claim actually is. This is why I focus this video on shadow governments and not general conspiracies, because Occam's razor works against the shadow government and also in favor of it, since it isn't a stretch to look at how controlled modern society is and conclude that it is like that by design. Even before we get a glimpse through the sunglasses in They Live, it is not hard to spot how people are already being mind controlled. As Nada is walking down the street, we see some guy just being absolutely out of reality, staring at a TV in a store. Or most importantly, when the police clear the homeless encampment, they leave behind only the TV. So when Nada puts on the glasses and starts seeing the truth, the effect is in a way satisfying. satisfying because you finally see the literal truth. How billboards, magazines, and even street signs are only there to control you. And this was all before smartphones and social media. Nowadays, people are glued to their phones, addicted to algorithms that are designed to get as much of your attention as possible, on platforms that regularly censor and delete content that goes against various political narratives. Before, you didn't know what was going on because the regular person didn't have the opportunity to broadcast on national television, whereas now they do. And it is that ability which has also shown how dangerous the wrong opinions are. So, a shadow government may or may not exist, but what does certainly exist and has always existed is correct behavior. It sounds obvious, but even if there is no secret cabal, there are always people who try and tell others what to do. In the context of this video, it relates primarily to things like political correctness, where even though you have freedom of speech, there is still this unspoken rule as to which ideas you can and which ones you cannot present. Shadow government or not, there is definitely a layer of social control that exists. Films like They Live are heavily exaggerated versions of these concepts because they allow us to see them more plainly. After reading 1984, you don't throw the book away because the outside world doesn't look like Airstrip 1. You look for those small nuances, those social norms and policies that are what lead up to a dystopian regime. You look for the first link in a chain of madness and corruption, which we are also wired to do. I mentioned before that the fantasy of a shadow government is there to make our world more interesting, but that wasn't the entirety of it. Because humans literally need an enemy. Whether it is an annoying neighbor or an entire country, we have a psychological need for rivalry. Mainly because humans evolved as hunter-gatherers and our survival largely depended on scouting out enemies before they could attack. We evolved with this inherent need to find something to fight, and you see it all throughout history. After a war, there is a very brief period of total peace, but then something has to start again. Whether it is a fight against an ideology or your own government, we have always looked for something to fear. The hippie movement was about peace, yet at its core it was still a fight. They didn't fight with guns, but instead with ideas. They had an enemy and they sought to destroy that enemy the best they could. And the hippies are an important element because they too believed in the deep state, which reveals that this is a conspiracy both sides of the political spectrum can adopt and use for their own means. Simply look at how both the political right and left have hijacked the film They Live. Originally, it was made to be a warning against rampant commercialization, but over time it has evolved into being a warning against any sort of control. Where at first it was adopted by the left, now it has also been adopted by the right. Most recently during COVID, where it was used to show how laws and incentives urging people to wear masks and vaccinate were really just there to control us. Therefore, the idea of an all-powerful secret cabal is an idea that can be adopted no matter what your beliefs are. A perfect world can never be real because it literally feels too good to be true. Whereas a world where bad things happen feels realistic, which ties in perfectly with the theme of a shadow government. It's an appealing idea because it makes the power of the government feel legitimate. If COVID had happened by accident, then that would mean the government is quite powerless. Decades of conspiracy would be debunked because the shadow government couldn't even keep a cold virus in check. Whereas if COVID was a part of a big plan to control humanity, that would mean the government is truly competent and actually powerful. So as much as that might seem like a bad thing, when something like COVID happens, it is much nicer to believe that it was something humans could actually control. But that still doesn't explain why there's so much culture around this simple conspiracy. TV shows like The X-Files use the shadow government as their primary antagonist. So why do we love entertaining ourselves with this idea? Well, it's because it makes something like a shadow government actually fightable. A book like 1984 is depressing and it only shows how the government is really in total control. But just by reading it, you are fighting that ideology. It gives you information, which, as we know, is the strongest weapon against a totalitarian regime like the one in 1984. You learned what the party fears most and even how to avoid being caught. So while Winston does in the end give up and lose, he's only a martyr against that idea. A shadow government in reality wouldn't be fightable. In They Live, aliens who can travel at the speed of light wouldn't be uncovered because you destroyed one transmitter. So stories that show humanity fighting an unfightable enemy make for good stories and cautionary tales for how an oppressed society would look like. Consumerism is exactly what They Live warned against, and because of that film, it is easy to look at modern society and spot its flaws. You open social media and look what is the real message behind the poster or advertisement, where and why people's opinions opinions actually come from, because to break the truth, a lot of people form opinions based on what is socially accepted instead of what is factually and objectively true. And that is why people believe and even want a secret shadow government to exist. It isn't a fantasy most people are actually aware of, because that is the way it works on the human mind. It is presented as a hidden truth, and therefore when you accept it, it feels like the opposite is actually the fantasy. I honestly don't know if a shadow government exists. It could or it could not. There is definitely a layer of politics and government that the public doesn't know about. Projects like MKUltra that simply haven't been disclosed, or operations like Watergate that haven't been accidentally discovered. But whether or not there is a secret layer of government controlling the president, the media, and even football games, I really cannot say. Because it could literally exist, but the absence of evidence means that it probably doesn't. We know that underground groups like mafias do work, and they do exist. Therefore, what's stopping a massive mafia from forming up top? It would be a mafia that wouldn't have to abide by any laws at all, except the laws of physics, I suppose. If you enjoyed the video, let me know in the comment section down below. I would love to hear what you think about this topic, or maybe you have unanswered questions or suggestions. In any case, check out the channel for more in-depth videos like this. Live long and prosper.